It started with a group hike up in the Adirondacks. There were four of us: me, my best friend Josh, his girlfriend Kelly, and her brother Nate. We were seasoned hikers, not amateurs who wandered off without maps or water. Josh had even done parts of the Appalachian Trail before, and I trusted him more than anyone to lead us right. The plan was simple: a 2-day loop on a lesser-known trail. Nate had picked it out. He said it had stunning views, and it wasn't too crowded. That sounded perfect to us. We wanted peace, not tourist-packed trails. The first day was great. Clear skies, cool weather, and plenty of laughs as we trudged along. We camped near a stream that night, and I remember the firelight reflecting off everyone's faces, their smiles warming me more than the flames. I thought, this is exactly what life should be. But on the second day, things started to go wrong. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just little things. The map didn't quite match up with the landmarks we were seeing. Paths seemed narrower, overgrown, like no one had walked them in years. But Nate swore we were fine. "Trust me," he said. "It's a shortcut." We didn't question him. Big mistake. The trees got denser and the sunlight barely reached us. It was like walking into another world. The air was heavy, damp, and carried this faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. Still, we pressed on, hoping the trail would open up again. That's when we found the first marker. It was a weathered wooden sign nailed to a tree, but the writing was so faded we couldn't read it. Below it, though, there were symbols, etched deeply into the wood. They looked almost like runes or some kind of ancient script. Kelly joked that it was probably a warning, and we all laughed nervously, but inside I felt something shift. By the time we realized we were lost, it was too late. The GPS couldn't get a signal, the compass spun uselessly, and even the sun seemed stuck in the same spot, as if it refused to move. And then we heard it, the laughter. It was faint at first, almost like wind through the trees, but unmistakably human. High-pitched, playful, but not right. Not normal. We froze, looking at each other, and Josh called out, "Hello, is someone there?" No answer. Just more laughter coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. We tried to ignore it, but it followed us. The laughter was never too close, but never far enough to feel safe. By evening, it was joined by whispers. Indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from all directions. We couldn't make out the words, but they crawled under my skin like ants. Then we saw them. The figures. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, just shadows moving between the trees. But they weren't shadows. They were pale, almost translucent. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like they didn't quite understand how to walk. "Did you see that?" Nate whispered, his voice shaking. We all nodded. No one wanted to say it out loud, but we were being watched, stalked. Josh tried to keep us calm. He said we just needed to keep walking, keep moving forward. But the forest didn't want us to leave. Every path we took looped back on itself. No matter which direction we turned, we ended up at the same place, a clearing with a single dead tree in the center. Its bark was blackened, like it had been struck by lightning, but the branches were covered in strange, white ribbons that fluttered even though there was no wind. Kelly started crying. She said she felt like we were being pulled, like something wanted us there. And I felt it too. This weight pressing down on me, urging me to stay, to give up. When night fell, it got worse. The laughter grew louder and the figures came closer. We could see their faces now, if you could call them that. They were blurred, smudged, like someone had erased their features, but their eyes, oh God, their eyes were black pits, endless and empty. We tried to make a fire, but the wood wouldn't catch. It was damp, even though it hadn't rained in days. So we huddled together in the dark, clutching our knives and whispering prayers to gods we didn't believe in. Around midnight, Nate screamed. One of the figures had grabbed him. Its hand was skeletal, with fingers too long and too many joints. It dragged him toward the dead tree, and we all lunged to pull him back. I swear, it felt like trying to tug him out of quicksand. The thing was strong, impossibly strong, but we managed to free him. Nate was hysterical, sobbing and clawing at his arm where it had touched him. His skin was blistered, like he'd been burned, and the smell of charred flesh filled the air. "We have to go," Josh said, "now." But the forest didn't let us. The paths were gone, swallowed by the undergrowth. The whispers turned into screams, echoing around us, and the figures closed in. They didn't touch us again, but they didn't have to. Just the sight of them, the sound of their unnatural moans, was enough to drive us mad. And then Kelly vanished. 1 second, she was right there holding my hand. The next, she was gone. No sound, no struggle, just gone. We searched for hours, calling her name until our voices were hoarse, But deep down, I knew we wouldn't find her. She was theirs now. By dawn, we were barely holding it together. Nate was delirious, mumbling about the runes on the tree and how they were a gateway. He said we'd crossed into their world, that we didn't belong here. And I believed him. Josh was the next to go. We were running, just running, blindly crashing through the trees when he tripped. Before I could help him up, they were on him. The pale figures swarmed him, dragging him into the shadows. His screams still haunt me. They didn't sound human. They sounded like an animal being torn apart. I don't know how I escaped. Maybe they let me go. Maybe they wanted me to tell their story, to warn others. When I stumbled out of the woods, I was alone. My clothes were shredded, my body covered in cuts and bruises, but I was alive. Barely. The authorities didn't believe me, of course. They said my friends must have gotten lost, that I'd hallucinated from dehydration and fear. But they didn't see the marks on Nate's arm, or the way Kelly vanished without a sound. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the laughter again, faint and distant, but unmistakable. And I know they're still out there, waiting for their next victims. So if you ever find yourself deep in the woods and you see a weathered sign with strange symbols, turn around, don't keep going, because they'll find you, and they'll never let you leave.
Story number 2.
It was supposed to be a quick weekend getaway, a cabin deep in the Smoky Mountains, far from the chaos of the city. A few of us decided to make the trip. Me, my cousin Ellie, her fiancé Mark, and our friend Lucas. The idea was simple: unplug, unwind, and enjoy the solitude of nature. The cabin itself was old, a relic of some bygone era, the kind of place with creaky floorboards and an ancient stone fireplace. It stood at the edge of the forest, the trees pressing so close they almost swallowed it. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, just silence, broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the whisper of the wind. The first night was uneventful. We cooked over the fire, drank a little too much, and stayed up late swapping ghost stories. Lucas, always the skeptic, laughed at our tales. "It's all nonsense," he said. "Ghosts, monsters, it's just our brains playing tricks on us." Looking back, I wish he'd kept his mouth shut. The next day, we decided to explore the woods. Mark had found an old trail on an outdated map in the cabin, one that wasn't marked on any modern guides. He said it led to an abandoned mining settlement about 2 miles away. It sounded perfect, rustic, and just a little adventurous. The trail was overgrown, barely more than a faint line cutting through the trees. As we walked, the forest grew darker. The canopy was so thick it felt like twilight, even though it was midday. The air was heavy, damp, and carried an odd, sour smell that none of us could place. Ellie was the first to notice something strange. "Do you hear that?" she asked, stopping in her tracks. We all paused, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing, just the rustle of leaves and the distant chirp of birds. Then I heard it. A faint clicking sound, like rocks tapping together. It was rhythmic, deliberate. "What is that?" Lucas muttered, his earlier bravado gone. Mark shrugged, trying to act unfazed. "Probably just water dripping on rocks or something. Let's keep moving." But the sound followed us. No matter how far we walked, the clicking was always there, just out of sight. It was almost hypnotic, like it was luring us deeper into the woods. When we finally reached the settlement, I almost wished we hadn't. It wasn't much, just a handful of rotting wooden structures, their roofs caved in and walls sagging with decay. Rusted mining equipment lay scattered across the clearing, and the entrance to the mine itself was sealed with heavy planks, though some had rotted away, leaving a dark, gaping hole. "Creepy," Ellie said, hugging herself. "Why would anyone live out here?" Lucas smirked, his confidence returning. "Because they were miners, Ellie, not exactly luxury seekers." "Let's just look around and head back," I said, not wanting to stay any longer than necessary. The place felt wrong, like the forest itself was watching us. As we explored, the clicking grew louder. It echoed around the clearing, bouncing off the broken walls and the trees. It didn't sound like dripping water anymore. It sounded deliberate, purposeful. That's when we saw the first one. It was Lucas who spotted it, standing near the edge of the clearing. At first, he thought it was a person. "Hey," he called out, waving. But as it stepped closer, we realized it wasn't human. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that were too long and a body that seemed to shimmer, almost translucent. Its head was tilted to one side as if it were studying us, and then it moved, jerky, almost insect-like, its joints bending in ways that made my stomach churn. Ellie screamed, and the thing snapped its head toward her. Its face, God, its face. It didn't have eyes, just hollow sockets that seemed to drink in the light. Its mouth was wide, filled with jagged, uneven teeth that clicked together in a grotesque rhythm. The clicking. "Run!" Mark shouted, grabbing Ellie's hand. We bolted, not caring about the trail or the direction. All that mattered was getting away from that thing. But the forest didn't make it easy. The trees seemed to close in, the undergrowth tangling around our feet, and the clicking, it was everywhere now, surrounding us, growing louder and faster. Lucas was the first to fall. I heard him cry out, and when I turned, I saw it, the creature standing over him. Its long fingers wrapped around his neck, lifting him off the ground like he weighed nothing. He thrashed and screamed, but it didn't let go. It tilted its head again, almost curious, before dragging him into the shadows. We didn't stop running. I didn't even have time to process what had happened. My only thought was to keep going, to get as far away as possible. But the forest wouldn't let us. We stumbled into another clearing, this one dominated by a massive tree. Its trunk was scarred with strange symbols, carved deep into the bark. They looked ancient, almost ritualistic, and hanging from its branches were dozens of small wooden totems. They swayed gently, though there was no breeze. The clicking stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then Ellie screamed again. She was staring at one of the totems. I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. The totems weren't made of wood. They were bones, human bones, lashed together with strips of leather. Some were fresh, the flesh still clinging to them. And on one of them, hanging near the center, was Lucas's necklace, the one his wife had given him, the one he never took off. Mark grabbed my arm. "We have to go, now." But the forest had other plans. As we turned to leave, the clicking started again, louder and more frantic than before. The creatures emerged from the trees, dozens of them, their pale, shimmering bodies surrounding us. Their mouths clicked in unison, a horrible, grinding sound that made my ears ache. Mark shoved Ellie toward me. "Take her! Go!" "Mark, no!" Ellie screamed, but he was already charging at the nearest creature, a broken branch in his hand. It didn't matter. They swarmed him, their long fingers pulling him down. His screams were short-lived. I don't know how I managed to drag Ellie away. The forest was a blur of shadows and movement, the clicking always just behind us. I didn't stop running until I saw the cabin, its weathered walls standing like a beacon of hope. We burst inside and slammed the door, bolting it shut. Ellie collapsed on the floor, sobbing. I grabbed the shotgun hanging above the fireplace, though I wasn't sure it would do any good. The night was endless. The clicking surrounded the cabin, a constant reminder that they were out there, waiting. By dawn, the sound stopped. The forest was quiet again, almost peaceful. But I knew better. Whatever those things were, they were still out there. Ellie and I left the cabin that morning, walking until we found the road. We flagged down a passing car and told the driver we'd gotten lost hiking. We didn't mention the creatures or the mine. Who would believe us? I've never been back to the Smoky Mountains. I don't hike anymore. Ellie doesn't talk about that night, and I don't ask. But sometimes late at night, I hear the clicking again, faint, distant, like a warning or a promise.
Story number 3.
I still can't believe I made it out alive. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces. And every time I try to tell someone what happened, the words get caught in my throat. But tonight, I need to get this out. Maybe writing it down will help. Maybe it'll make sense. Maybe it'll stop the nightmares. It started 2 weeks ago when my cousin Ben called me about a road trip. Ben always had this knack for finding weird, off-the-beaten-path attractions. He'd heard about this abandoned amusement park out in the middle of nowhere, deep in the backwoods of West Virginia. "Come on," he said over the phone. "It'll be fun. Just you, me, and Claire." Claire was his girlfriend, and I liked her well enough. I figured why not? It wasn't like I had anything better to do. The park, called Riverview Funland, had closed down in the late 70s after a tragic accident on its Ferris wheel. That's the official story, anyway. According to Ben, there were rumors of darker things, disappearances, strange sightings, and a fire that destroyed most of the grounds. Locals said the place was cursed. That should have been enough to keep me away. But it wasn't. The drive took us deep into the woods, far from any town or main road. By the time we pulled up to the rusted gates of Riverview, the sun was already setting. The park was in worse shape than I'd imagined. The metal arch over the entrance was barely standing, its faded letters covered in vines. Beyond it, the rides were twisted skeletons of their former selves, their frames silhouetted against the crimson sky. Ben was ecstatic, practically bouncing as he unloaded his camera gear. "This is amazing," he said, grinning. Claire didn't look so sure, and honestly, neither was I. But Ben had that way about him, that reckless enthusiasm that made you want to follow him even when you knew better. The first hour wasn't too bad. We explored what was left of the park, snapping photos and making stupid jokes to lighten the mood. The air smelled of damp earth and rust, and every step we took kicked up clouds of dust. The old carousel was the creepiest thing we saw at first, its chipped and weathered horses frozen mid-gallop, their painted eyes staring into the void. That's when Claire found the journal. It was lying near the ruins of the ticket booth, its leather cover cracked and water-stained. She handed it to Ben, who flipped it open. The handwriting inside was spidery and uneven, like whoever wrote it was in a hurry, or terrified. Most of it was illegible, but we could make out a few words. "They're watching, can't leave. Shadows, don't trust the faces." Ben laughed it off. Probably some teenager trying to freak people out, but Claire didn't look convinced. She kept glancing over her shoulder like she was expecting someone, or something, to be there. I should have listened to her. We all should have. We decided to check out the Ferris wheel next. It was the park's most infamous landmark, looming over the ruins like a sentinel. Up close, it was even more unsettling. The metal was blackened, warped by fire, and the seats hung crooked, swaying gently even though there was no wind. Ben wanted a picture of the three of us in front of it. He set up his camera on a tripod, its flash the only light in the growing darkness. The moment he clicked the shutter, I felt it. A cold, heavy presence, like we weren't alone anymore. "Did you hear that?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all froze, listening. At first, there was nothing. Then came the sound, a soft, distant laughter, echoing through the ruins. It wasn't the kind of laughter you'd expect at an amusement park. It was wrong. Too high-pitched, too distorted, like it was coming from someone, or something that didn't quite understand how to laugh. "Probably just the wind," Ben said, but his voice was shaky. "Let's go," Claire urged. "We've seen enough." But Ben wasn't ready to leave. "One more spot," he insisted. "The old funhouse. It's just over there." The funhouse was a crumbling mess, its once colorful facade faded to a sickly gray. The entrance was a yawning black hole, its doorway framed by a grinning clown whose paint had peeled away, exposing the rotting wood beneath. I didn't want to go in, but Ben was already heading inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Come on," he called back. "It's probably the creepiest part." Reluctantly, Claire and I followed. The air inside was stifling, thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The floorboards creaked under our weight, and the walls were covered in warped mirrors that distorted our reflections into grotesque shapes. That's when we saw them. At first, I thought it was just another warped reflection. But the figure in the mirror wasn't moving like us. It was standing perfectly still, watching us. Its face was blank, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a smooth, featureless surface. "Ben," I whispered, pointing. He turned his flashlight toward the mirror, but the figure was gone. "Probably just a trick of the light," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. But then the laughter started again, louder this time, and closer. The mirrors around us began to shimmer, like something was moving behind them. Shadows flickered, darting just out of sight. "Run," Claire whispered, grabbing my arm. We bolted for the exit, but the funhouse didn't want us to leave. The hallways seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. The mirrors reflected things that weren't there, shapes, faces, movements. "Where's Ben?" Claire cried. I turned, and he was gone. 1 second, he was right behind us, and the next, the hallway was empty. His flashlight lay on the floor, its beam cutting a jagged line through the dark. "Ben!" I shouted, my voice echoing uselessly. The laughter grew deafening, reverberating through the funhouse like it was alive. The shadows in the mirrors grew darker, thicker, until they started spilling out into the hallway, writhing and twisting like living smoke. We ran, blindly, until we burst out into the open air. I gasped, expecting relief, but the park wasn't the same. The rides were no longer broken skeletons. They were whole again, their lights flickering weakly in the darkness. The carousel spun slowly, its Calliope music playing a warped, dissonant tune. The Ferris wheel creaked as it turned, its seats swaying ominously. And the shadows were still there. They seeped out of the funhouse, spreading across the ground like spilled ink. The laughter had turned into whispers now, 100 voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. "Ben's still in there," Claire cried, trying to run back. I grabbed her, holding her back. "No, he's gone!" She fought me, screaming his name, but I wouldn't let go. I dragged her to the car, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would explode. The shadows followed us, pooling at the edge of the parking lot, their tendrils reaching for us as we sped away. We never found Ben. The police searched the park but came up empty. They said he must have gotten lost in the woods or fallen into one of the old mine shafts nearby. They didn't believe us about the shadows, or the laughter, or the things in the mirrors. Claire moved away after that. I haven't spoken to her in months. I can't blame her. Sometimes I wish I could forget, too, but I can't. Not when I hear the laughter in my dreams. Not when I catch glimpses of shadows moving in mirrors that shouldn't be there. And not when I see Ben's face among them.
Story number 4.
I wasn't supposed to survive. I don't know how I did, and some days I wish I hadn't. You see, there are things in this world that shouldn't be messed with. Things that don't belong in the light of day. But we didn't know that. We thought we were just going camping. It was me, my best friend Tyler, his girlfriend Sam, and her younger brother, Jacob. We had planned a weekend trip to a remote spot in the Appalachian Mountains. Tyler had heard about a place called Ash Hollow, a secluded valley untouched by modern life. He said it would be off-grid, the perfect place to relax. We packed light, just the essentials, and hiked in on a narrow, unmarked trail. The deeper we went, the quieter the forest became. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just an eerie, unnatural silence. The air felt heavier with each step, but Tyler laughed it off, saying it added to the wilderness vibe. When we reached Ash Hollow, I'll admit it was beautiful. A clearing surrounded by towering trees, with a shallow creek winding through the middle. We set up camp near the creek, pitching our tents and gathering firewood. As the sun began to set, Jacob found something strange near the edge of the clearing. "Guys, check this out," he called. We walked over to see what he was talking about. It was a circle of stones, each one etched with symbols I didn't recognize. The ground inside the circle was barren. No grass, no moss, just hard, dry earth. Tyler said it was probably an old fire pit, but I could tell he didn't really believe that. Sam didn't like it. "It feels wrong," she said, backing away. "Like we shouldn't be here." But Tyler waved her off. "It's fine. It's just some weird old thing, probably from whoever used to live out here." The first night was uneventful. We cooked over the fire, told stories, and stared at the stars. But something woke me up in the middle of the night. A sound, soft, almost imperceptible. It was like whispering, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, though I couldn't understand the words. They were harsh, guttural, like nothing I'd ever heard. "Tyler," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. He groaned and sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Do you hear that?" He listened for a moment and shook his head. "It's just the wind," he muttered before lying back down. But I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I told Sam and Jacob about the whispering. Sam looked uneasy, glancing toward the circle of stones. "I don't think we should stay here," she said. "Something's not right." Tyler laughed. "Come on, it's just your imagination. We've got the whole weekend. Let's not ruin it over some creepy vibes." I didn't argue, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We spent the day exploring the valley. The forest was dense, the trees so tall they blocked out most of the sunlight. As we walked, I noticed strange things. Trees with deep gashes in their bark, like claw marks, and patches of ground where the grass had turned black. "Probably a bear," Tyler said when I pointed out the marks, but they didn't look like claw marks to me. They looked deliberate, almost like writing. By the time we got back to camp, the sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the clearing. That's when Jacob found the footprints. "Guys, come look at this," he said, his voice shaking. The prints were huge, easily twice the size of a human foot, with long, pointed toes. They circled our campsite, leading toward the circle of stones before disappearing into the forest. "What the hell is that?" Sam whispered, clutching her arms. Tyler frowned. "Probably just some animal." "An animal with feet like that?" I snapped. "Are you kidding me?" He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed a flashlight and scanned the tree line. The beam of light wavered, catching nothing but branches and shadows. "We'll be fine," Tyler said, though he didn't sound convinced. That night, the whispering came back, louder this time. It seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding the tent. I lay there, frozen, listening as the whispers turned into low, guttural growls. And then I heard something outside the tent. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, circling us. Tyler, I hissed, shaking him awake. He sat up, his eyes wide. What is that? I don't know, I whispered. But it's close. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a scraping sound, like claws dragging across the fabric of the tent. Sam let out a muffled scream, and Jacob whispered, "What do we do?" Before anyone could answer, the tent collapsed. Something heavy was on top of it, pinning us down. Tyler shouted, wrestling with the fabric, while Sam and Jacob screamed. I managed to crawl out through a tear in the side and scrambled to my feet. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs and skin as pale as bone. Its face was featureless, except for a gaping mouth filled with jagged teeth. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were empty sockets, black and endless. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its head tilting as it studied us. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Sam's arm and pulling her away. Tyler and Jacob followed, the thing letting out a guttural roar as it lunged for us. We ran blindly into the forest, the creature crashing through the trees behind us. The whispering was everywhere now, echoing through the woods, growing louder and more frenzied. Jacob tripped, falling hard onto the ground. Tyler stopped to help him, but the creature was faster. It reached them in seconds, its long fingers wrapping around Jacob's leg. He screamed as it dragged him into the darkness. "No," Sam cried, but Tyler grabbed her, forcing her to keep moving. We ran until we found a cave, its entrance hidden beneath a tangle of roots. We scrambled inside, pressing ourselves against the cold, damp walls. The creature didn't follow us, but we could hear it outside, its guttural growls echoing through the trees. We stayed there until dawn, too afraid to move. When the first light of morning broke through the trees, we finally emerged. The forest was quiet again, but the marks of the creature were everywhere. Deep gashes in the trees, footprints in the dirt, and a trail of blood leading back toward the clearing. We made it back to the trailhead and called for help, but when the search party went into Ash Hollow, they found nothing. No circle of stones, no footprints, no signs of Jacob. Just an empty campsite and the ruins of our tent. I don't know what that thing was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that Jacob's gone, and we'll never see him again. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear the whispers.
Story number 5.
When I think back on that night, it feels like something out of a fever dream. Something that couldn't have been real, but it was. I'm alive to tell the story, though sometimes I wish I weren't. It all started with a dare. My friends and I were bored one Friday night, scrolling through our phones and trying to come up with something to do. That's when Nick brought up Hollow Creek Manor. It was an old, crumbling house on the outskirts of town, shrouded in urban legends. People said it was cursed, that anyone who went inside never came out the same, or didn't come out at all. "Let's check it out," Nick said, his eyes gleaming with that reckless excitement he always had. "Are you insane?" My friend Rachel shot back. "That place is dangerous." "Come on," Nick grinned. "It's just an old house. What's the worst that could happen?" I should have listened to Rachel, but Nick had a way of making you feel like a coward if you said no. So, against my better judgment, we agreed. It was me, Nick, Rachel, and our quietest friend, Matt. He never said much, but when Nick suggested the dare, he just nodded and followed along. We piled into Nick's car and drove out to the edge of town. The house loomed ahead, silhouetted against the night sky. It was enormous, its roof sagging and windows shattered. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, and ivy crept up walls like veins. "Creepy as hell," Rachel muttered, crossing her arms. Nick laughed. "That's the point." We parked and approached the house. The air felt colder here, heavier, like it was pressing down on us. As we stepped onto the overgrown lawn, I noticed something strange, the silence. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Just an oppressive stillness. "All right," Nick said, pulling out a flashlight. "The dare is simple. We go inside, look around, and stay for an hour, then we leave." "Easy for you to say," Rachel snapped. "You won't shut up about how fun this is." Nick grinned, but even he looked uneasy as we stepped through the front door. The inside was worse than I expected. The floorboards groaned beneath our feet, and the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper. The air smelled damp like rotting wood and mildew. Dust floated in the beam of Nick's flashlight as he swept it across the room. "Let's split up," Nick suggested. "Are you crazy?" Rachel hissed. "We stick together." But Nick was already moving toward the staircase, his flashlight bobbing in the dark. Rachel and I exchanged a look. then followed him, with Matt bringing up the rear. The house was a maze of narrow hallways and empty rooms. Most of the furniture was gone, but here and there we saw strange things. A doll with its face melted off, a mirror with cracks running through it like spiderwebs, a rocking chair that swayed gently even though there was no wind. "Creepy," Nick whispered, though his voice didn't carry its usual confidence. We came to a room at the end of the hallway, its door slightly ajar. Nick pushed it open, revealing what looked like a nursery. The walls were painted a faded pink, and a crib sat in the corner, its mattress covered in mildew. "Why would anyone leave this here?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, Matt pointed to the wall. His flashlight revealed something scrawled across the peeling paint. Words written in what looked like rust or dried blood. "Don't play with her." "Play with who?" Rachel whispered. We all froze as a faint giggle echoed through the room. It was soft, high-pitched, and unmistakably a child's laugh. My stomach dropped. "Let's get out of here," Rachel said, her voice shaking. Nick hesitated, his bravado faltering, but then he nodded. "Yeah, okay, let's go." As we turned to leave, the door slammed shut. Rachel screamed, and Nick lunged for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Calm down," he said, though his voice cracked. "It's probably just stuck." Then the giggle came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of tiny footsteps running across the floor. The crib creaked, its frame rocking back and forth on its own. "Open the door," Rachel screamed, pounding on it. Nick yanked on the handle with all his strength, and finally it gave way. We stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. "What the hell was that?" I shouted, my heart pounding. "No idea," Nick said, his face pale. "Let's just..." Before he could finish, we heard it again, the giggle followed by the sound of footsteps. This time, they were coming from behind us, echoing down the hallway. "Run," Matt said, his voice low and steady. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted down the stairs, our footsteps echoing through the empty house. The front door was in sight, swinging gently on its broken hinges. But as we reached it, the door slammed shut, just like the one upstairs. Rachel screamed again, and I felt something cold brush against my arm, like icy fingers trailing over my skin. "Keep going," Nick shouted, kicking at the door. It wouldn't move. That's when we saw her. She stood at the top of the staircase, a little girl in a tattered white dress, her hair hanging in tangled strands over her face. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. She just stood there, staring at us through her hair. "Who are you?" Nick demanded, his voice cracking. The girl tilted her head, her movements jerky and unnatural. Then she pointed at Rachel. Rachel's eyes widened. "No, no, no, no." The girl let out another giggle, louder this time, and then she moved. It wasn't walking. It was like she glided, her feet barely touching the ground. She was on us in seconds, her cold, bony hands grabbing at Rachel. "Help me," Rachel screamed, clawing at the air. Nick and I grabbed her arms, pulling with everything we had, but the girl's grip was unrelenting. Her face twisted into a grotesque smile, her mouth stretching wider than it should have, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Matt stepped forward, his expression calm. He held up something, a small crucifix he always wore around his neck, and shouted, "Let her go." The girl hissed, recoiling like a wounded animal. Rachel fell to the floor, gasping for air, and the girl vanished into thin air, her laughter echoing one last time. The front door creaked open, and we didn't wait to question it. We ran, stumbling into the night, not stopping until we reached the car. No one spoke on the drive home. Rachel was shaking, her arms covered in bruises where the girl had grabbed her. Nick stared straight ahead, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Matt sat silently, clutching his crucifix. We never went back to Hollow Creek Manor. A few weeks later, we heard that it had burned to the ground, though no one knew how the fire started. I'd like to think that means whatever was in that house is gone. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it. The giggle, faint and distant. And I know she's still out there, waiting.
Story number 6.
It was the night my life changed forever. The kind of night that leaves you questioning everything you thought you knew about the world. I wasn't supposed to be there. None of us were. It started with a road trip. My friends and I, Jess, Tom, and Carla, had planned a weekend getaway. The goal was simple. Drive through the Pacific Northwest, stop at a few scenic spots, and camp out under the stars. It sounded perfect, an escape from the monotony of everyday life. The trouble began when we took a detour. Jess, our navigator, insisted there was a shortcut through the dense woods of Devil's Ridge. The name alone should have been a red flag, but we laughed it off. "It's just a name," Tom had said, shrugging. The road was narrow and winding, flanked by towering pines that blocked out most of the moonlight. The farther we drove, the quieter it became. No animals, no rustling leaves, just the hum of the car's engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. Carla, sitting in the back seat, joked about how it felt like the beginning of a horror movie. In hindsight, I wish she'd been wrong. About an hour in, the car started sputtering. "What the hell?" Tom muttered, pulling over. He popped the hood, and we all got out to stretch our legs. The air was cold and damp, carrying a faint metallic tang I couldn't place. While Tom fiddled with the engine, Jess wandered a few feet down the road. "Hey, check this out," she called, shining her flashlight into the trees. The beam illuminated a narrow trail leading into the forest, marked by an old, rusted sign. The letters were barely legible, but I could just make out the words, Oak Hollow Cemetery. "Creepy," Carla said, hugging her jacket tighter. "Let's stay on the road, please." But Jess, ever the thrill seeker, grinned. "Come on, it's probably some old graveyard." "How cool would it be to check it out?" Tom groaned, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Can we fix the car first? Then you can chase ghosts or whatever." The engine wasn't cooperating, and after an hour of trying, Tom threw up his hands in frustration. "We're stuck here for the night." "Great," Carla muttered, stranded in the middle of nowhere. Jess, unfazed, grabbed her flashlight. "Well, if we're stuck, I'm checking out the cemetery. Who's coming?" I hesitated, but Tom sighed and grabbed a flashlight from the trunk. Might as well, beats sitting around. Reluctantly, Carla and I followed. The trail was overgrown, the ground soft and uneven beneath our boots, branches snagged at our clothes, and every snap of a twig made my heart jump. The air grew colder the farther we went, the metallic smell intensifying until it was almost overwhelming. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a clearing. The cemetery was small and ancient, the headstones worn smooth by time. Many were tilted or broken, half buried in the moss-covered ground. A few crumbling statues stood guard, their features eroded beyond recognition. "See? Cool, right?" Jess whispered, her breath visible in the chilly air. "Not the word I'd use," Carla muttered, glancing around nervously. We wandered among the graves, our flashlights casting eerie shadows. That's when we noticed it, an open grave near the center of the clearing. The earth was freshly disturbed, the edges of the hole sharp and clean. "Who the hell digs a grave out here?" Tom asked, his voice low. "No idea," Jess said, peering into the hole. "It's empty." As she said it, a low sound echoed through the clearing. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder, a deep, guttural moan that seemed to come from all around us. "What was that?" Carla whispered, clutching my arm. "Probably the wind," Jess said, though she didn't sound convinced. Then we saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall and thin, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw its face, pale, hollow, with sunken eyes and a wide, gaping mouth. "Who's there?" Tom shouted, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, staring. Then, slowly, it raised one long, bony hand and pointed at us. "Run!" I whispered, but no one moved. It wasn't until the figure let out an ear-piercing scream that we snapped out of our daze. We bolted down the trail, the sound of heavy, uneven footsteps pounding behind us. The metallic smell was overwhelming now, like blood and decay. I didn't dare look back. When we reached the car, we scrambled inside, slamming the doors shut. Tom turned the key, and miraculously, the engine roared to life. We sped down the road, the figure disappearing into the darkness behind us. No one spoke the entire drive back to town. When we finally reached Jess's apartment, we sat in silence, too shaken to process what had happened. The next day, we tried to talk about it, but no one could agree on what we'd seen. Jess insisted it was just some weirdo messing with us. Tom wasn't so sure. Carla refused to discuss it at all. As for me, I've tried to move on, but I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see that figure, its hollow face, its outstretched hand, and at night, when everything is quiet, I swear I can still hear it scream.
Story number 7.
It happened last fall when my brother and I decided to spend the weekend at our family's old cabin deep in the Appalachians. It had been years since anyone had used the place. Our parents had warned us growing up that the woods surrounding the cabin were dangerous. My dad used to tell stories about hunters and hikers who vanished without a trace. We always thought it was just a way to keep us from wandering too far. Turns out, he wasn't lying. The first day at the cabin was uneventful. We arrived in the late afternoon, unpacked and set up the place. The air was crisp and cold, and the sun cast long shadows through the trees. My brother Ethan was excited to get back to nature. He loved hiking and insisted we head out early the next morning to explore one of the old trails nearby. I wasn't as eager. Something about the woods felt off. I couldn't explain it, but the silence unnerved me. No birds, no insects, just an oppressive stillness that seemed to swallow every sound. Ethan laughed at my unease, calling me paranoid. I brushed it off, not wanting to seem like a coward. Coward. The next morning, we set out just after sunrise. The trail was overgrown, barely visible beneath layers of fallen leaves. Ethan led the way, his backpack bouncing as he bounded ahead, pointing out landmarks he vaguely remembered from when we were kids. I followed, keeping a wary eye on the forest around us. About 2 hours in, we came across something strange. A clearing with a massive tree in the center. Its gnarled branches twisted unnaturally, reaching out like skeletal fingers. The trunk was covered in deep carving, symbols I didn't recognize, interspersed with what looked like names scratched into the bark. "What do you think this is?" Ethan asked, running his fingers over the markings. "Probably some weird art project," I said, though I didn't believe it. The symbols felt old, ancient, like they didn't belong here. Ethan shrugged. "Let's keep going." As we moved past the tree, I felt it, a heavy, suffocating pressure like the air had thickened. My chest tightened and I struggled to catch my breath. Ethan didn't seem to notice, marching ahead without a care. We hadn't gone far when we found the first one. It was a shoe half buried in the dirt. At first I thought it was just trash, but then I saw the sock still inside, tattered and faded. It looked like it had been there for years. "Creepy," Ethan said, nudging it with his boot. I wanted to turn back. I told Ethan as much, but he just laughed. "Come on, it's probably just some hiker's old gear. Don't be such a baby." Reluctantly, I followed him. But as we pressed deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. The trees seemed to close in around us, their twisted branches blocking out the sunlight. Then we found the second one. This time it was a backpack. It was torn and weathered, but the contents were still there. A water bottle, a map, a notebook. Ethan picked it up, flipping through the pages of the notebook. Most of it was illegible, the ink smeared and faded, but one phrase was repeated over and over: "It watches from the trees." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Ethan, we need to go." "Come on, it's just some weirdo's journal," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. We kept moving, but now I was on edge, every shadow and sound setting my nerves on fire. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced we were being watched. Ethan tried to joke around, but even he was quieter now, his usual bravado fading. Then we heard it. A soft rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, closer. Ethan froze, holding up a hand for me to stop. "Probably just an animal," he whispered, though he didn't sound convinced. The rustling stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl. My blood ran cold. Whatever it wasn't any animal I'd ever heard. "Run," Ethan said, grabbing my arm. We bolted, crashing through the trees, not caring about the trail anymore. The growl followed us, accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps. I didn't dare look back. My only thought was to keep running, to get as far away as possible. Ethan was ahead of me, his backpack bouncing wildly. "This way," he shouted, veering toward the left. I followed, my legs burning as I pushed myself to keep up. That's when I saw it. A shadow, massive and humanoid, moving between the trees. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fast. It didn't run, it glided, almost like it was floating. I couldn't make out its face, just a void where its features should have been. "Ethan, it's right behind us!" I screamed. He didn't respond, just kept running. I could feel it gaining on us, the air growing colder with every step. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. We burst into the clearing with the carved tree, and suddenly the footsteps stopped. The oppressive weight lifted, and for a moment there was silence. Ethan doubled over, gasping for air while I collapsed to my knees. "What the hell was that?" I choked out. Ethan didn't answer. He was staring at the tree, his face pale. I followed his gaze and froze. The symbols on the tree were glowing, faintly pulsing with an eerie, greenish light, and beneath them a new name had been carved: Ethan. "No," I whispered, backing away. "No, no, no." Ethan stumbled toward the tree, his expression vacant. I can't move," he said, his voice trembling. I grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back, but it was like he was rooted to the ground. His eyes rolled back, and he let out a blood-curdling scream as the tree's branches moved, wrapping around him like tendrils. Ethan, I shouted, clawing at the branches, but they were impossibly strong. They pulled him closer to the trunk, the glowing symbols growing brighter. His screams cut off abruptly, and then he was gone, absorbed into the tree, leaving no trace. I don't remember how I got back to the cabin. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling through the door, gasping and shaking. The police didn't believe me when I told them what happened. They searched the woods but found no trace of Ethan, no tree, no glowing symbols. Now, every time I close my eyes, I see his face, hear his screams, and sometimes late at night, I hear it. The low growl coming from the trees outside my window.
Story number 8.
It started with a sound, a faint tapping on the window of my apartment. I lived on the 14th floor. At first, I thought it was the wind or a branch scraping against the glass, even though there were no trees anywhere near the building. I ignored it, turning up the volume on the movie I was watching. But the sound persisted, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. Tap, tap, tap. It was almost midnight, and the city outside was cloaked in its usual hum of distant sirens and honking cars. Still, something about that tapping set my nerves on edge. I finally stood up, my heart pounding as I approached the window. The blinds were down, so I couldn't see outside. My fingers hesitated on the cord. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind. But deep down, I knew better. When I pulled the blinds open, there was nothing there, just the city lights stretching into the darkness. I exhaled, laughing nervously at my paranoia, and turned away. Then came the knock. It wasn't a tap this time. It was a firm, deliberate knock, like someone was standing right outside my window. My blood turned to ice. I whipped around, staring at the glass, but there was no one there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" No answer. I backed away from the window, grabbing my phone. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That something was knocking on my window 14 stories up? They'd think I was crazy. The knock came again, louder this time. I dropped my phone and it clattered to the floor. My breathing was shallow, my hands trembling. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I crept toward the window, my eyes scanning the glass for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it. A face, pale and featureless, pressed against the glass. Its skin was smooth and waxy, like a mannequin, but its eyes, they were black. Not just dark, but completely void of light, like staring into an abyss, and they were staring right at me. I screamed, stumbling backward. The face didn't move. It just stayed there, watching me, its mouth stretching into an unnatural grin. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The grin widened, impossibly so, and the glass began to creak. Cracks spiderwebbed across the surface, as if something was pressing against it from the outside. I grabbed my phone and ran, slamming the bedroom door shut behind me. I called the police, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hit the buttons. The operator tried to calm me down, but I could barely explain what was happening. "There's something, at my window," I stammered. "Officers are on their way," she assured me, though her tone carried a hint of skepticism. I stayed on the line, my back pressed against the door, listening. The tapping started again, this time on my bedroom window. I glanced toward it, my stomach dropping when I saw the outline of a figure on the other side of the glass. It was the same face, the same horrible, featureless face, staring at me with those void-like eyes. The operator's voice brought me back to reality. "Ma'am, are you still there?" "Yes," I whispered, clutching the phone like a lifeline. "It's outside my bedroom now. Stay where you are. Do not engage. Officers are..." The call cut off. Static filled my ear, followed by a low, guttural whisper. It was faint, almost indistinct, but I could make out the words, "Let me in." I dropped the phone, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping turned into pounding, the glass rattling in its frame. I backed away, my mind racing for a plan. There was no way out. The only door led back into the living room, where the thing had been at the first window. The pounding stopped. Silence. For a moment I thought it was over. Then the bedroom window shattered. I screamed, diving to the floor as shards of glass rained down around me. When I looked up, the figure was gone. The window was empty, the night sky stretching out beyond it. I didn't wait to find out what was going to happen next. I bolted out of the bedroom, grabbing my keys and wallet from the counter. I was halfway to the front door when I heard it again, the whisper. "Let me in." It wasn't coming from the windows this time. It was coming from the front door. My hand froze on the doorknob. Slowly, I turned my head, my breath hitching as I saw the shadow beneath the door. It wasn't a person. The shape was wrong, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. I backed away, my mind screaming at me to run, to do something, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The shadow shifted, and the doorknob began to turn. That's when the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the apartment, plunging me into an abyss of terror. I fumbled for my phone, the screen casting a faint glow as I turned on the flashlight. The beam swept across the room, illuminating nothing but empty space. I could hear it now, moving inside the apartment, the soft scrape of something dragging across the floor. My flashlight flickered, the beam weakening as the sound grew closer. Then I saw it. Standing at the end of the hallway, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Its body was twisted, limbs bending in ways that defied logic. The face was the same, smooth, pale, and empty, except for those black, soulless eyes. It didn't move. It just stared at me, its grin stretching wider and wider until it seemed to split its face in two. My phone died, plunging me back into darkness. I don't remember running. I don't remember how I made it down 14 flights of stairs without tripping and breaking my neck. All I know is that I ended up on the street, gasping for air, tears streaming down my face. The police found nothing when they arrived. No broken windows, no shattered glass, nothing to suggest that anything had been there at all. They chalked it up to a nightmare or stress, said I must have imagined it. But I know what I saw, and now every night I hear it. The tapping. It follows me, no matter where I go. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it wants. But I do know one thing. It's only a matter of time before I can't stop it from getting in.
Story number 9.
I always hated taking the night shift at the gas station. There's something about being isolated under the hum of flickering fluorescent lights, surrounded by miles of empty road. It was a dead-end job, but it paid the bills, and on most nights it was uneventful. Until that night. It started like any other shift. The air outside was heavy with the threat of rain, and the highway was eerily quiet. I had a couple of regulars stop by, truckers grabbing coffee and snacks, a local teenager buying cigarettes with a fake ID that I pretended not to notice. By midnight, the station was empty, and I was left with just the soft buzz of the freezer units to keep me company. Around 1 a.m., the bell above the door jingled. I looked up, expecting another trucker, but no one was there. The door slowly swung shut, the faint sound of rain tapping against the glass. "Hello?" I called out, stepping around the counter. No answer. The aisles were empty, and the parking lot was deserted except for my car. I shook my head, blaming the wind for tripping the sensor, and went back to my station behind the counter. But something felt off. The air had grown colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Minutes passed, and I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone. That's when I saw it. Movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow darted across the security monitor. I glanced up, scanning the screens. There were 4 cameras, one showing the parking lot, one at the front door, one inside the store, and one overlooking the back hallway. On the screen showing the front door, I saw someone standing just outside the glass. They were wearing a hooded jacket, their face obscured in shadow. They stood perfectly still, facing the door, but making no move to come inside. "Can I help you?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. No response. They didn't move, didn't flinch. They just stood there, staring. I grabbed the microphone connected to the exterior speaker system. "Hey, if you're not buying anything, move along." The figure tilted their head slightly as if they were curious. Then, slowly, they raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. Their fingers were long and thin, the skin pale and almost translucent under the glow of the station lights. My stomach churned. Something wasn't right. I reached for the phone to call the police, but when I glanced back at the monitor, the figure was gone. The parking lot was empty again. I exhaled shakily, trying to convince myself it was just some prank, maybe a drifter messing around. But I couldn't shake the unease that crept over me. The rest of the shift passed in tense silence. I kept glancing at the monitors, half expecting the figure to return, but the screens remained clear. By the time my replacement showed up at 6 a.m., I was ready to bolt. "Rough night?" Jeff, my coworker, asked as I grabbed my coat. "You have no idea," I muttered, not wanting to explain. I left without another word, hoping I'd never have to take another night shift. But the next night, I got a call. Jeff hadn't shown up for work, and the manager begged me to cover. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I told myself the figure wouldn't come back. It was probably just a one-time thing, a random weirdo passing through. I arrived at the station around 10 p.m., the rain from the previous night now a steady downpour. The shift started uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. By midnight, I was glued to the security monitors, my eyes scanning for any sign of movement. At 2 a.m., the bell above the door jingled again. This time, I stayed behind the counter, clutching a flashlight. "Hello?" I called out. Silence. The door slowly closed and the store was empty. I checked the monitors, but there was no one in sight. My heart was pounding as I stepped out from behind the counter, the flashlight beam cutting through the dimly lit aisles. I heard it then, a faint, raspy whisper. It was coming from the back hallway, near the storage room. The sound sent chills down my spine. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The whispering stopped. I crept toward the hallway, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to leave. But something compelled me forward. As I reached the storage room door, I saw it was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, the flashlight revealing rows of shelves stacked with supplies. And then I saw him, Jeff. He was crouched in the corner, his back to me. His clothes were soaked, his shoulders shaking as if he were crying. "Jeff?" I whispered. Relief flooded through me. "What the hell, man? Are you okay?" He didn't respond. Slowly, he turned his head to look at me, and I froze. His face wasn't his face anymore. His eyes were black, empty voids, and his mouth twisted into an unnatural grin, teeth too sharp and too many. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his skull. Before I could move, he lunged at me, his movements impossibly fast and jerky. I screamed, stumbling backward and dropping the flashlight. The room plunged into darkness as I scrambled to my feet and bolted. I didn't stop running until I was outside, rain soaking through my clothes. I jumped into my car and sped away, not daring to look back. I quit the job the next morning, refusing to go near that station ever again. They never found Jeff. The manager said he disappeared without a trace. But I know what I saw, and sometimes late at night I still hear that whisper. It's getting closer.
Story number 10.
I should have known better than to take that shortcut. The old road through Ravens Hollow was infamous around here, the kind of place locals warned you about with a hushed tone and a nervous glance. "It's cursed," they'd say. But it was late, and I was tired, and the idea of shaving 20 minutes off my drive was too tempting to resist. The first few miles were uneventful. The road was narrow and lined with trees that loomed overhead, their branches tangled like skeletal hands. My headlights barely pierced the darkness, and the occasional pothole jarred me awake. The GPS signal had cut out almost immediately after I turned onto the road, but I figured as long as I stayed straight, I'd come out on the highway eventually. That's when the fog rolled in. It came out of nowhere, thick and heavy, swallowing the car in a suffocating gray. My headlights were useless against it, reflecting the mist back at me and leaving me blind. I slowed to a crawl, gripping the wheel with white-knuckled hands, my heart pounding. The radio, which had been playing a static-laced country station, fizzled out completely. And then I saw her. She was standing in the middle of the road, a pale figure barely visible through the fog. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the damp asphalt as the car screeched to a stop. My heart was in my throat as I stared at her, my mind racing. She looked young, maybe late teens or early 20s, wearing a white dress that seemed to glow in the dim light. Her hair was long and dark, hanging in wet strands over her face. I rolled down the window, my voice shaky. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond. She just stood there, unmoving, her face obscured. The air inside the car grew cold, so cold that my breath came out in visible puffs. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't just drive away. What if she was hurt? What if she'd been in an accident? I unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out into the fog. The air was damp and heavy, clinging to my skin like a wet blanket. "Miss," I called out, taking a cautious step toward her. "Do you need a ride? Are you hurt?" She tilted her head slightly, her movements slow and unnatural like a marionette on tangled strings. A chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong. "Okay, look," I said, forcing a nervous laugh. "If this is some kind of prank, it's not funny." That's when she turned her head and I saw her face, or what was left of it. Her skin was pale and mottled, her eyes sunken and blackened as if they'd been burned out. Her mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing jagged teeth that seemed too large for her face. And then she screamed, a high, piercing wail that seemed to shake the ground beneath me. I stumbled back, my heart hammering, and scrambled into the car. My hands fumbled with the keys as the fog thickened, the world outside the windshield disappearing entirely. The scream grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was coming from inside the car. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I slammed the car into reverse, spinning the wheel and flooring it. The tires squealed as I backed down the road, my eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the swirling fog outside. And then she was there again, standing directly behind me. I screamed, jerking the wheel hard to the left. The car veered off the road, the tires sliding in the mud as I fought to regain control. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just inches from a gnarled tree. The fog began to thin, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then I heard it, the soft, wet sound of bare feet slapping against the pavement. She was walking toward me. I locked the doors, my hands trembling as I fumbled with my phone. No signal. Of course. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then there was a sharp knock on the driver's side window. I turned, and she was there, her face inches from the glass, her grin wider than ever. Her eyes were empty pits, but I could feel them boring into me, searing into my mind. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was like she was draining the life out of me just by looking at me. "Let me in," she whispered, her voice soft and raspy like dry leaves scraping against stone. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "Go away!" I screamed. "Leave me alone." She laughed, a low guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "You're already mine," she said, her voice echoing inside my head. I don't remember how I got out of there. The next thing I knew, I was on the highway, the fog gone and the stars shining brightly overhead. My hands were still gripping the wheel, my knuckles white, and the car was trembling beneath me as I sped away. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station, where I stumbled out of the car and into the brightly lit store. The clerk gave me a strange look as I collapsed onto a chair, my chest heaving. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, handing me a bottle of water. I nodded, though I didn't feel okay. I think I saw something," I stammered. He frowned. "You didn't come through Raven's Hollow, did you?" My blood ran cold. "Yeah," I whispered. "Why?" He shook his head, his expression grim. "You're lucky you made it out. Most people who see her don't." "Who?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "The woman in white," he said. "She's been haunting that road for decades. They say she was a bride who died in a car crash on her wedding night. Now she waits for travelers, looking for someone to take her place." I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, that horrible grin, those empty eyes. It's been weeks now, and I still can't shake the feeling that she's watching me. Sometimes late at night, I hear soft footsteps outside my window, and sometimes just before I fall asleep, I hear her whisper, "You're already mine."